Welcome back to RSA Conference 2021. We are broadcasting live in Broadcast Alley, virtual Broadcast Alley. I am your host, Matt Alderman. Joining me for this interview segment is Laura Koetzle. She is a vice president of group research at Forrester Research. Welcome, Laura.
Thanks. Thank you for having me.
Now, we're going to talk about securing the roaring 2020s. And to start, I'm going to go back a century. We had the roaring 1920s, and we had some very interesting things happen in the 1920s. And I'm curious, are they different a century later, or are they the same?
Different. So thankfully, I'm not predicting a stock market crash of any kind, not my field, nor do I think it's realistic that we'll be giving prohibition a try again, which I'm relieved to think about. But the reason that you'll see roaring 2020s in some of our research and also just in the world in general is not just because it sounds catchy and because everybody likes sort of pictures of the Gatsby era, because there are a bunch of similarities. So what we've already seen in the first very eventful year, I think we can all agree, of the roaring 2020s, is where we obviously all were dealing with and are dealing with a global pandemic, the likes of which we've not seen for a century, is what I would generalize as upswellings of systemic risk. And so our thought, and I think there's lots of other folks who've expressed similar sentiments in all kinds of different fields, not just in technology research like us and in consumer research like us, is that that's what we should expect to continue. That this decade is going to involve a lot of specific things that are sort of sharp discontinuities. So think about all of the unseasonable weather events that we've already had in the last year and change, right? Freeze in Texas that resulted in electricity outages and water shortages, stronger than usual cyclones, longer and stronger than usual droughts, et cetera, et cetera. And so coupled with kind of an uncertain geopolitical environment and sort of some uncertain social environments within certain countries, you can see how already this has been a decade of all kinds of unforeseen events or sort of things you might have expected in the general case, but not necessarily in that specific mode. And so I think what we need to think about for the next decade is that's going to happen a lot. So we need to be prepared to adjust to the unexpected. I am not trying to predict that we're going to have another global health pandemic in the next 10 years. I really, really hope not. I think I can speak for the whole world when I say that. But I think we should all get used to a lot of kind of things happening quickly that we weren't necessarily anticipating. And so we need to adjust. And that's true in cybersecurity, and it's true kind of in business and in the world at large.
Yeah, and when I think about all the things we've already experienced in the first 17 months of this decade, it's created some havoc also for security professionals, for the CISOs, for executive leadership across many, many industries. And you laid out some shifts that are happening. And I want to start with the first one because it's an interesting concept around customers will demand safety and convenience. What about employees? Do employees also? Right. And so this is why. I came out of the nuclear power space. My early career I was in nuclear power 7.5 years. And as an employee at a nuclear power facility, and then I did do a little bit of work in oil and gas, safety is the driver. It's all about safety. And we've never taken, we've talked about this analogy of, is security like a safety discussion, right? But we've never treated it like the way some of these industrial plants treat safety. Do you see a shift in the way we think about the mindset of customers and employees more around safety versus security, or do we have to think about both?
So in the consumer mindset, so the reason I said also, right, is that employees, all of us are also consumers, right? So we don't sort of, especially now when we're all working, or at least a lot of us are working out of our houses a lot of the time. Like this is one room in my house here in Amsterdam. And we don't shed our kind of ideas as consumers and as human beings when we walk in the door of or turn on the Zoom client at work, right? That's always been true, but it's, I think, more true now than ever. And that's been sort of an accelerating trend for the last, at least decade, probably 2 decades, because of this sort of blended nature of the way a lot of us do our work. And for most cybersecurity professionals, we would fall solidly into that category, right? Because a lot of us sort of sit in front of a computer all day, right. Whether that the computer is at our house or at an office. Or in an airport in sort of my former traveling days, which will return again, I'm hoping. Because next time we have RSA conference, I'm really hoping that I won't be in virtual Broadcast Alley, but in real Broadcast Alley instead. So I think there's that. And so consumers want sort of safety in the sense. So what we meant by kind of safety and convenience is the sort of countervailing pressure of, as different regions of the world emerge from a severe phase of the pandemic where movement was restricted, you've got sort of countervailing and contradictory seeming, because they are customer/consumer desires for both. I want to get out there and shop in stores and do all the things that I used to do as soon as humanly possible. And also, I am not entirely sure it's safe yet. And I also like the convenience of some of the things that I started to do digitally that I maybe didn't do digitally prior to the pandemic. So I did them digitally of necessity, but I like that convenience. And so I want to retain that convenience too. But your different angled question is also a fascinating one. So forgive me for kind of trying to answer this all at once. I'm hoping for everyone listening that I'm making some sense as I jump around here. But the thinking about information security in cybersecurity, however one wishes to phrase this, as safety in the kind of the sense that process control industries, nuclear power, manufacturing, et cetera, think of safety is something that's a transition that I honestly thought would happen a long, long time ago, just because it made natural sense. But it hasn't really happened, I think, I would say, other than in some very specific contexts. So in some companies and organizations that are in those kinds of business, so electric utilities and nuclear power facilities and kind of manufacturing facilities and so on, in those specific contexts, they have often treated some of their cybersecurity challenges as like safety. But even in those kinds of companies, because the people doing information security are mostly not people from the kind of industrial space, they're people like me who come from sort of software and in general, and for information technology more broadly, rather than from industrial control systems and places like that. And so even if they're sort of addressing a cybersecurity universe at a company whose business is mostly kind of very focused on safety because of what it does for a living, other than in the specific context of the manufacturing floor or the nuclear power station inside it itself, they haven't necessarily approached all the cybersecurity challenges in that safety-focused way. Having said all that, I am still hopeful that as kind of the challenges of cybersecurity continue to, infiltrate's a kind of loaded word, but continue to become more of a part of the industrial controls kind of environment, I am hopeful that the kind of safety orientation that comes with the industrial world will kind of back migrate, if you will, into the cybersecurity world. Do I know this will happen? I don't. I think it would be good for us if it did, quite frankly, if we sort of took some of the long established principles of how you deal with safety, because safety in an industrial sense is like, do people die or get injured or not? And keeping that kind of mentality taking that kind of mentality rather, and sort of migrating that kind of risk mitigation into the cybersecurity field, I think would be quite a good thing. Yeah. Now, there are a lot of caveats. There are a lot of like, oh, but it's not the same, et cetera, et cetera. Totally granted. I absolutely understand that. But I think the kind of safety mindset that comes with those kinds of industrial environments, like the one you used to work in, would be a very good thing for us to finally import into the world of cybersecurity.
Yeah, and the reason I asked that question is really to set up the next two, because brands will create hybrid experiences and stakeholders will build the future of work. And in both of those scenarios, what gets interesting is it's hard sometimes to differentiate the consumer from the employee in a hybrid or remote work world. And so how do we influence, or how do we create cyber appreciation, right? We talk about awareness, but it's more about appreciation. Can I be safe online? Can I be safe working from home and being a consumer, doing things and protect my organization, right? Which is why I asked the first question, is because if we think about it from a safety perspective instead of a security perspective, just change the term for a second. Now I can start to create cyber appreciation across a consumer and an employee world, which I think is kind of where we're going. Because to your first point, I want to go into a store and shop, but I want to feel safe, but I want the convenience. So I can also do it online, but there's also a lot of potential attacks when you're online buying things. And the same thing when you're working remotely from home. And so these first three were just very interesting to me to try to tie together to say, if we think about cybersecurity more as a cyber safety mechanism, it might give us the ability to actually make some strides in the industry.
I think that's quite a good point. And I'd say this, which is, I remember years, and I don't remember how long ago, but it's got to be the better part of a decade, I want to say. Interviewing the then CISO of Intel. And the reason I mention this is because way back then, so I think about 10 years ago, they had figured out that the way to get their whole employee base, because remember, obviously they manufacture things in addition to all of the kind of people at Intel, but all the people at Intel that we know, who sort of work at office jobs like a lot of us do. They figured out that the way to get their whole employee base to care about cybersecurity was to actually say, okay, employees, we're going to protect you at home and at work. And so back then, they had a lot of employees without kind of without security, like basic antivirus type software of their own. And so they actually distributed it on, probably, this is probably long enough ago that some of it was on CD, to all of their employees, and said, look, we protect you at work. We're going to protect you at home too. And so here are the things that we want you to do. And that they found that to be a very beneficial program, because they saw kind of better uptake of security training and just sort of better hygiene and behavior from their employees overall. And can they prove it's causal? Could they prove it's causal at the time? No, but they could certainly see that it was correlated, and that's hundreds of thousands of employees. So that was, at the time, one of the few examples of a very conscious, I'm going to protect my employees wherever they are kind of program, even if those employees really didn't do work from home, because you have lots of factory employees who do their work at work because you can't manufacture stuff at your house, or at least back then you certainly couldn't. Obviously now you've got 3D printing and so on, but even so, you're not going to be 3D printing advanced chips anytime soon. Anyhow, the reason I mentioned that is because that was at the time quite ahead of its time. And so I think, given the further blending of kind of personal and professional, and of all of us as employees and as consumers, that kind of approach to, especially at a moment where most of your employees are working remotely because they have no choice in a lot of countries, because it is not permitted to go back to offices just yet. And so the idea that sort of we are not only kind of trying to protect you in a work context, but we know that you're exposed in a personal context too. And so the tools that we're giving you are tools to protect you wherever you are, whether that's software tools or training, sort of experience with two-factor authentication, et cetera, et cetera. And so giving your employees advice that helps them in their whole lives, and also helps them keep their kids safe online and things like this that are very closely connected to their personal welfare, has a positive impact on employees' sort of general satisfaction and behavior from all of the research that we've done. And so I think that's going to be a general trend that you'll see a lot more of. And indeed, I think the experience of the pandemic will only have accelerated that.
Yeah, I think it's that positive reinforcement from securing the employee to securing the consumer makes us all more aware, and therefore more better employees and better consumers, or safer employees and safer consumers from a security perspective. That's why I wanted to close that loop. There were two other points in here, and I wanted to talk about them. Smart firms will retire technical debt. This has been bane of many organizations' existence forever. We did an interview for a pre-record on vulnerabilities from a piece of software that's 20 plus years old, right? It still has all this technical debt in it. It sounds great. I think it's a lot harder to do. So how does an organization start to tackle their technical debt to alleviate some of this old technology?
So we're not suggesting that you're going to be able to retire all of it by any means, and certainly not all at once. But the suggestion we're making is that, in the never waste a good crisis vein, right? So this has been an unsettled period. Results for many companies have not been great. What we have seen is that some of them have taken that opportunity to say, and then you've got the companies who are growing really fast because they're in the grocery delivery business or in healthcare or what have you, because of their specific area of business, given what the pandemic has done to the world. And so I think this has been an opportunity both for sort of companies that had the sort of balance sheet and kind of stakeholder wherewithal to do it, and for the ones who happen to be growing really fast, and so they sort of needed to fix a bunch of stuff really quickly to actually meet demand. That they said, okay, let's get rid of a bunch of old stuff that we've been hanging on to because it was too expensive to replace. Given that we're in a place where our results aren't very good, so let's spend some money and do something we know we need to do anyway. Move a bunch of stuff to the cloud, get rid of, retire a bunch of legacy stuff that we know we've needed to retire for a while, but we just haven't had the wherewithal or the time to do it. Or we need to meet a 300% increase in demand, so the old stuff simply won't cut it anymore. We're going to throw money at the problem and retire a bunch of this stuff and put something new in place. So that's kind of what we're getting at there. So that's good for a whole variety of reasons, right? Getting rid of technical debt is just architecturally a good thing and gives you more options because it means you're not locked into kind of constraints of yesteryear, which, by the way, today is not to sort of let you think that I have any illusions about this. I have worked in technology and cybersecurity for far, far too long to have very many. And the deal here is, today's state of the art is tomorrow's legacy, right? So whatever we commit to now, that's fantastic and sort of gives us all the possibilities that we need. 5 years from now, there will be something better, assuredly. And so there's never retiring technical debt is kind of a continual process of sort of moving the needle rather than something you do episodically, hopefully. And the reason that's really important is because the companies that have been able to do it through whichever means, either they were growing really fast or they took the opportunity to do it because they had kind of the appropriate wherewithal, either from stakeholders or budgetarily or what have you, that will put them in a better position than companies that didn't have that wherewithal or who were complacent and were like, whatever, the money's rolling in the door, fine, I don't need to change a thing. Because fast forward 2 years into the future, if a Company A has retired a bunch of technical debt and thus has a bunch of new options, and Company B has not, Company A is liable to be able to change more quickly to confront whatever the latest discontinuity is. Whether it's a unforeseen weather event or whatever it is, sort of geopolitical event. That geopolitical event that means that all of the suppliers in a certain region get knocked out. Whatever roaring 2020s thing we get thrown at us, if you've got sort of more flexibility because you've retired a bunch of the stuff that constrained you, you will be better able to respond to whatever that crisis is.
Yeah, which ties into your final point, which is resiliency will be a competitive asset, right? By retiring technical debt, leveraging newer technologies, having more flexibility, resiliency will be something that allows these businesses to survive the next event, not knowing what it's going to be, right? It puts them in a better position.
Exactly. And the thing to remember is that, like most things, resiliency isn't free. It has a cost. And because you can think of it this way. So if you're sort of super highly optimized, you are kind of, by definition, less resilient, because optimization means making choices about the world continuing to be as it is. And so our very macro argument here about the roaring 2020s being sort of with a lot of upswellings of systemic risks at points that are difficult to predict, means that investing in kind of slack capacity to respond to whatever that event is, which includes things like retiring technical debt, is the right way to invest. Because in an environment where change is going to happen quickly and you don't know what the change is going to be and you don't know exactly when it's going to happen and how big a disruption it's going to be, it makes sense to invest in as much agility, slack in the system as you can, so that whatever it is, you can respond to it properly. And that's not free, right? So the easiest example to think about is right now, if you manufacture anything, you've probably got a lot of your supply chain optimized to be very, very optimized, to be just in time, as in you only keep the minimal number of parts to manufacture thing X on hand because you know that they're going to be delivered every 2 days or every 3 days or whatever the schedule is. So in a world where disruption is liable to happen, you would factor that in and go, all right, now I need to keep 5 days or 8 days of parts on hand or whatever it is, to say that will give me the capacity to deal with a supply disruption or with a transport disruption that is going to happen, we think, once every, 7 months. I'm making all of this up, but it's the simple, like in terms of the exact numbers, but it's the simplest way to think about it. That's not free in the sense that then you need to order more inventory, full stop, and you need to have more real estate set aside to keep that inventory in.
Yeah.
And so that's absolutely a cost that you're incurring, but you're incurring it so that you're less likely to have your production line sitting idle because you haven't gotten a certain part delivered in 6 days.
Which is why we still don't have our new cameras because they're still on back order, and why the automobile industry is struggling so much because of chip shortages. So yes, very relevant
exactly.
to today. Yeah.
So anybody who's tried to buy a computer that they want, GPUs or other kinds of chips for recently, or sort of anybody who's anticipating their next car, all about this because you're waiting in line.
Yeah, exactly right. Laura, thank you so much for joining us on Security Weekly.
My pleasure. Thanks so much for having me.
And with that, we're going to take a quick break, but stay tuned. We have more micro interviews coming up next.